Okay, so I got everything started, waiting on one more person to let in, and then, all right, so take a few minutes to look at that page. We're going to go log into the AP book, AP Classroom, and we're going to look at the videos there. We're going to look at them together, but I want you to, so we're going to watch the videos together, but then I'm going to let you do the topics on your own. So, but they go along with that page in Canvas. So please read that so you have some understanding of what he's talking about. And I'm going to go ahead and quickly do the attendance before I start sharing. Okay, we have 3 people missing. Okay. Okay. Hopefully you remember how to get into your AP Classroom. If you forgot, if you go to your homepage and you look under Student Resources, let me do this as a student. Go ahead and share our class resources. So you click on class resources, you have the link that'll take you to the AP Classroom, AP College Board. And you've all already signed in. So that should be all you need to do. Once you get there, we are going to be in the unit 2.3, which is the same thing you're looking at in your Canvas, biogeography. So we're going to watch these 3 videos together. Okay, let me come out. I forgot to turn the sound on. And then I'm going to let you do the topic questions after we watch the videos. Now, while you're watching the videos, jot down some notes, jot down names of scientists. He's going to talk about a couple of scientists in the first one. You do need to know that you need to know where the Galapagos Islands are. And so kind of pay attention to things like that, okay? All right, so go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and start the first video, and hopefully all of you have logged into your AP classroom by now. Okay, and again, we're going to watch there's 3 videos assigned to you, so you can go back and watch them anytime, but we're going to watch them together, and then I'm going to let you do the topic questions on your own after that. All right, I watched it already, so I started
AP
over.
Daily. Environmental students, my name is Mr. Skolton. In the previous lessons, we covered topics like biodiversity and ecosystem services. In this lesson,
Oops.
Welcome, environmental students. My name is Mr. This lessons, we covered topics like biodiversity and ecosystem services. In this lesson, I want to demonstrate how those 2 concepts fit into biomes, and especially if biomes have any decrease or degradation that occurs within their habitat. So the theme of this topic is island biogeography. And so we'll look at what that is and how that plays a role in biodiversity. So in science courses, we like controlled experiments where we can manipulate the variables, and it's something that usually happens in a laboratory setup. But when we talk about a field study in ecology, it's really hard to have controlled variables because there's so many abiotic factors that you just can't control, and especially biotic factors too if you're looking at species. And so that's where an island is a perfect kind of field study for investigations, for testing hypotheses, because you definitely have a boundary. It's somewhat controlled in terms of migration of animals, plants the same way. So that's where this island theory of biogeography comes into play. So when we talk about the effect on biodiversity, let's start with a little history lesson here. So Carl Linnaeus is our father of modern taxonomy, and we have him to thank for learning Latin names, species names scientifically. And we also have Darwin, who is our kind of our father of evolution by natural selection. And he.
All right. So you've got Carl Linnaeus, you should write down, and you probably remember him from biology. You had to learn this system of naming. But the one that you need to know specifically is Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. Okay, so those 2 are environmental and have most to do with what you'd be testing on if you were doing an AP exam. So definitely know who those 2 are. They're listed up there at the top.
He's well known for obviously the Galapagos Islands, but it wasn't just the Galapagos. He traveled the world to kind of formulate his theory of evolution. And a contemporary of his who also contributed this theory of evolution was Alfred Wallace. And Wallace has a certain location in the Pacific named after him called the Wallace Line. You may not have heard of this, but he looked at all of the animals that kind of live in this area and noticed that on the west side of the line, they are all similar to those in Asia. And on the east side, the right side of this red line, those animals tend to be similar to those in Australia. So he looked at kind of all these little islands here in Indonesia and kind of came up with this idea that, yeah, some factors of biodiversity are determined by these islands. And then later, MacArthur and Wilson, together they co-authored a journal article in 1963 about this theory of island biogeography. And later they wrote a book on it. And to save you having to read the book, let's summarize here the kind of two main points they came away with. And that is, you're going to have a high species richness, more species, when you have large islands that are near the mainland. And you're going to have a lower species richness when you have small islands, small area, and they're going to be farther from the mainland. So the best is large and near, and the worst would be small and far. So with Darwin, he looked at finches and saw how the finches on different islands had adapted and evolved different traits depending on the resource availability and what their food source is. But we're obviously not always going to be dealing with islands in the ocean. So how does this island biogeography fit to ecology as a whole? So what do the Galapagos Islands have to do with other places of biodiversity? Well, the islands we're going to look at are islands of habitat. And so here's a biome, a temperate deciduous forest. Some of the species that we see here, kind of a range of trophic levels. We have generalist feeders and specialist feeders. And so this island, which we're going to look at in just a moment here, is and can be fragmented, can be cut and kind of bisected here. And this fragmentation can be caused by housing developments that, clear cut and then put buildings in. It can be a freeway construction, it can be a logging operation, converting this into agriculture or even cattle raising. So what happens when you fragment this habitat? Well, you've created two islands of this habitat. And so this idea of island biogeography applies not just to oceanic islands, but also to terrestrial ones as well. And kind of what species would we expect when these islands are formed from habitat? Now,
all right, I wanted to pause it there. So I want you to take a note that we live in a temperate deciduous forest, and where he's looking at is islands like Japan and that area over there where they actually have islands, but they are also in the same tropical zone that we're in. So they have similar species. We have deer and rabbits and finches and raccoons and squirrels. So they are similar. You can imagine what he's talking about where we live as well. Okay.
If you were able to kind of quickly glance when I showed you initially, the species, the fauna that were at the big piece, and now we have two parts of it, you'll notice we're missing a few species. We're lacking a few. So not all the species in this community will thrive in a fragmented habitat. When there's natural selection, when nature changes, it will select for some species and select against others. So which ones are we missing? If you noticed early on, it was those kind of large apex predators, the mountain lion, the wolf, and the bear. They prefer and they thrive in large tracts of land, connected, not fragmented. So what we have when we create these islands in this habitat, we actually see a decrease in core habitat. And because of that, it kind of selects against these apex predators. And conversely, we see an increase in edge habitat. There's more kind of surface area around, more perimeter around the edge of these. And some animals are just fine with that. And they can easily move from one woodlot to another. And we see a lot of maybe our generalist feeding species that are the ones that are selected for. And some of our large mammals, which could be specialist feeders, are selected against, and we don't see them as much. So when we see these, again, islands of habitat, over time, the species that are best adapted to that, to kind of evolved for this fragmented habitat, those tend to be the species that become the dominant ones, and we see less and less. And so obviously we could have our endangered, threatened animals being hindered by this fragmentation of habitat. So we'll continue this theory of island biogeography in the next video. So please join me for that, and thank you for watching this AP Daily.
All right. So far, any questions? We're looking at, let me get this to shrink. We're looking at, we had an island. We had all these species on one island, and for some reason, the island got fragmented or separated into two. So we still have the same species that existed on one. Now the same ones exist in two locations. So that's fragmented. All right, let's look at this one, second one.
Hello again, environmental students. This is Mr. Skolton, and this AP Daily video will continue with the topic of island biogeography and how it's impacted by both habitat and species biodiversity. So this theory of island biogeography and the study of the ecological relationship distribution of organisms on islands, we said these islands are not just marine or aquatic, oceanic islands, but these islands that exist on land too, terrestrial islands. So the islands, again, I want to focus on here in particular are going to be forests. And why forests? Well, because you can actually get some very good satellite images and see kind of the forest cover. So it's a real easy one to kind of visualize from a very large scale. So these are some satellite images taken from NASA. And we'll look here at this forest in Washington State, in North America here. And what's very impactful here is you can see the coloration. On the upper left is a kind of before, and then 26 years later, you see in the bottom right, the after. And so again, the darker greens are the old growth or the original, and then the freshly cut are the browns, and you see a variation in between. And so you can definitely see these squares, which are not natural, these squares that these patches have been created by humans. But even like this one here, you notice all the old growth forest, and then it's been now harvested. Or over here, this was harvested at one time, and it's starting to slowly regrow. So the idea here is kind of this fragmentation. It's dynamic. It changes from year to year. There are changes throughout. And so as you can see, as animals who live in this habitat, they have to be able to adapt to this. It looks like a quilt with all these different patches on. And from one year to the next, that quilt could be different. Let's look at our tropical rainforest in Cambodia, kind of the before and after. You can see, obviously, the loss of habitat, the fragmentation of habitat, especially, again, you can see the nice straight lines here from where humans have then adapted and altered this habitat. And if we zoom out even more on a world scale, and again, we just look at forests and just the forest biome, something we covered back in Unit 1, we can see how these forests are really just kind of patches of habitat, fragments of habitat on a global scale. So for example, if an organism were in this part here of Africa, it's surrounded by different type of biome. And it'd be very unlikely for that animal to be able to migrate unless it's a flighted animal, like a bird could actually fly and move away. Or you could look up here in terms of through Europe and Russia and Asia, it's a little more connected. So those fragments maybe allow for movement of species from one part to the other. Looking at North America again, this is again our current canopy.
Okay. Why did it do that? I don't know why mine just decided it didn't want to play anymore.
Through Europe and Russia and Asia, it's a little more connected. So those fragments maybe allow for movement of species from one part to the other. Looking at North America again, this is again our current canopy tree cover, very different than the pre-settlement before settlers came from Europe. We had much more tree cover then, but you can definitely see the fragments out here in the west, fragments here as well, of these woodlots. So kind of a closer view here of this, we'll say probably a boreal forest or taiga, because it looks like there's coniferous trees here. And you can see that there are definitely patches that have been removed and then patches that are remaining. You can see just the logging roads that are there and kind of the impact that they may have, in addition to loss of habitat, but also for erosion, loss of topsoil. And if we think about, in terms of the previous video, about we're creating edges, and we have the kind of the core habitat and the edge habitat. So this edge has much different abiotic conditions. It could be drier there because it can receive more sunlight. It could be windier there. And you can start to see possibly some disease set in. And I don't know if this is the case here, but you notice there's some of the brown trees there, maybe a little more susceptible because they are on the edge and not in the center. So that obviously plays a role on a larger scale when we create little pieces, little fragments. So what happens to these bare areas? Well, if they're just logged, they may be replanted, or they may be converted into some type of monoculture. And now here's a picture of a palm oil tree plantation, or a monoculture of just one cash crop. Usually this is going to be grown in the tropics, where they've removed some tropical rainforest and replanted it with just these trees, just nice rows, much like you would see in a cornfield. So obviously our fragments and the space between these fragments, these islands of habitat, differ. So this is quite vast, this gap here between the woodlot on the left and the wood on the right. And some species could traverse this and be able to move across this gap, this span. But obviously not all species can do that. And as I mentioned in a previous video, kind of our apex predators, the cougar in North America, the black bear and the wolves, they like more connected habitat rather than fragmented habitat. So you may not see your large mammals in something like this, but other animals like your white-tailed deer have no problem going across from one fragment to the other, and you might see more of those. So the space, the gap between them, or if you think of an ocean, these islands are separated by a large distance here, or they could be a kind of a shorter distance. So when we bisect habitat with the highway in this one, that obviously is creating a barrier for some animals that they would not want to cross or can't cross over that. But even something simple like a bike path, you and I might think no big deal. And really for like a deer, not a big deal for them. But if we think even smaller scale, think about invertebrates and insects, soil organisms, like they're not necessarily going to be able to move across this. So there is a barrier there that they, again, are restricted in terms of their movement. So even a bike path could be considered some type of fragmentation of this habitat. So what's the answer? What do we do to maybe correct this? Because obviously we're still going to have development. We're not going to change roads and bike paths. So what we want to be conscious of when we're kind of planning for different types of conservation and protection and enhancing biodiversity is a way to connect these. So the answer to fragmentation is corridors, habitat corridors. So this is obviously a ramp, almost like a pedestrian ramp, but this one is made or built for large mammals or really animals of any type that can actually traverse and go across this highway without fear of being injured. So yes, corridors, habitat corridors help to obviously connect habitats and make them less fragmented. And so when we earlier looked at how we increase the edge effect of habitats and we decrease the core area, if we can at least connect them with corridors, it allows one core area to be connected to another. So you could potentially have a large mammal move from one to the other. And again, these corridors would maintain the genetic diversity within that population. And actually the largest corridor project in North America is attempting to connect Alaska with Wyoming. So the Yukon with Yellowstone, so that animals could easily move north to south from Alaska through Canada to the lower 48 states. So please join me for our third and final video. It'll be our last video in this series about biodiversity. And thank you for watching this.
Okay, so the takeaway on that one is, first one was we created separate islands, so we fractured it. But now we don't want these organisms to be isolated. So now we're creating corridors so that they can continue to move back and forth within their environment and not be isolated the way that they are on the Galapagos Islands. All right, we're going to look at the third one, and then I'm going to let you work on
Hello, environmental
topic
students. My name is
questions.
Mr. Skolton, and this AP Daily video is going to conclude our topic of island biogeography. And I thought it would be nice to be able to share maybe a practical way to be able to measure this biogeography, biodiversity, and take something that's pretty large in scale to maybe something that's manageable and measurable in your own backyard. So there's various science practices that you will be experiencing throughout your AP Environmental course, and I want to focus on scientific experiments as well as data analysis and kind of show you something I have my students do when we cover this topic in class. So a quick review, we looked at how in the past we've investigated the evolution of species, the biodiversity, thanks to Darwin, and looking at finches as well as other animals on the Galapagos Islands. And again, we're not just dealing with oceanic islands here, we're actually dealing with fragmented habitat islands that are also on land. So what happens when that habitat is cut into pieces, sectioned off, how does that affect the biodiversity of the animals and the plants that are there? So the investigation question that I pose to my students is, let's say you were charged as a consultant to design a nature preserve. Maybe it's a new park, or someone has deeded some land. So what would be the best way to design that to increase the most biodiversity in that area? And so there's kind of this ongoing debate whether you should have one large tract of land or could you possibly have several small tracts of land, and what would be better in terms of biodiversity? So that's the question I pose to students. And then they would come up with a claim. So this is just an example. So they would then choose one or the other. And so a claim would be a single large preserve would have higher species diversity than one that has several small ones. So once again, we're kind of building out on what we've done earlier, like in topic 2.1, we learned that the larger number of species that there's going to be a better chance for them to recover if there's disruptions, like a fragmented habitat. Also in that same topic, we saw that the loss of habitat usually leads to a loss of specialist species. And so we obviously want to try to preserve as many species as possible. And then some species just need large territorial requirements, like the bear, the wolf, the cougar. And so we would want to have a large preserve. So all that kind of builds into the claim and why we would choose one versus the other. Well, the habitat that we use, we're fortunate enough to have a woodlot by our school, and it's a mixed deciduous hardwood forest, and we have leaves that drop every single fall. So we have a very thick layer of leaf litter. And within that leaf litter, there is a complex community of kind of arthropods, invertebrates that help to serve as decomposers and detritivores to kind of break down large pieces of the leaves into smaller pieces and then to kind of recycle those for the plants. So that's the habitat we use. So what I have the students do is go out and create islands. They actually disturb the habitat and they create these islands of leaf piles. And so between them, it's just bare ground. Now, you and I might think, hey, that's not that big of a deal, but when you're a little maybe earwig or a sow bug, that could create quite a barrier from one part to the other, especially if there's a predator. So it exposes them. They can't be hidden underneath the leaf piles, so they may be less likely to move from one pile to the next. And even if you think about the organisms that live within the soil, so maybe like some of the springtails and the annelids, like the worms, some of the nematodes, well, you're changing the abiotic conditions here. This is going to be exposed to the sun, could be warmer, could be drier, and that's also affecting that habitat as well. So again, the question at hand for the students is one large better or three small better? So these three islands here that they make, I give them these dimensions so that the area of all three of these together is the same area as this, what we call the mainland. And the mainland they sample, and then we just kind of set these islands up, and then we come back after a couple of weeks, and we do a comparison of the number of species that are on these 3 islands compared to the number of species in the mainland. And so we do just that. We come back and they just have this running data table of all the different things that are alive, that are crawling, creeping, wiggling through the leaf piles, and even in the soil as well. And then I tabulate all this, not just for one class, but all my classes. And early on, we looked at, well, how can you measure biodiversity? And what are some different ways to measure that? And so we looked at richness and evenness. And there's 3 indexes to do that. For richness, it's very simple. You just count up the number of species. For evenness, there's the Simpson and Shannon index, and there's ways to calculate that. And you can see the results here. And these are results of 2 different years, and you can kind of see some variation from one year to the next. So again, back to the question at hand, is it better to have 3 small preserves or 1 large preserve? So if we look at the richness numbers, there's 34 species here and 24 species here. So again, this kind of goes into their evidence. They would use this as evidence to kind of either support their claim or refute their claim. And if you look at the numbers, I mean, there is a difference, but you could go further into statistical analysis. And is this a big enough difference to make it meaningful? Or is this maybe just a null hypothesis and there really isn't much difference between these 2? So I always like to give them some raw numbers, some primary data to kind of be able to kind of wrestle with and figure out their support for their claims. So again, these are 2 different years. You can see the numbers there. And then what I have them do is just to learn some graphing skills and graph out the different islands. But again, you can see that the several small islands compared to the 1 large island has more richness, has more evenness according to the Shannon index, has more evenness according to the Simpson index. So those are just ways that I have my students design their evidence to kind of support or refute their claim. And the last thing I have them do is look at, again, this theory of island biogeography, meaning that the larger the islands would expect to have more species. So they do that. They kind of plot out the size and then they plot out the species richness. And you can see there is a slight correlation here between the 2. And so it would seem to support this theory that the bigger islands have more species to them. And then to kind of wrap up the investigation, I kind of give them these kind of what's next questions or some connection between what we did before. So as they kind of look at all of the organisms that they sampled, which ones were edge species? Did we see more edge species? Is that why we saw maybe an increase in species richness? Because we saw more edge species and we saw maybe less of those core habitat species, and maybe those core habitat species were more specialists, and we saw their numbers drop because of that. And to think about big picture, why would you do this, or how could you expand the scale of this and think bigger picture and maybe design this for something at school or for a building project? And within the investigation, I always have them kind of do a kind of a self-reflection. What could we have done better? Where are the sources of error? And believe me, anytime you involve, students and trying to pick up creepy crawly bugs and worms, not everybody wants to sift through those piles. And so we may not count every single one that's there, but those are just some examples of some sources of error. Well, this concludes the lessons dealing with island biogeography and how they relate to biodiversity. Thank you again for joining me and watching this AP Daily video.
Okay. So you want to tie those 3 topics together, and when you look at the 3 assigned topic questions. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and let you all answer these on your own. I'll be checking the internal gradebook to see how you've done. All right, so if you took a nap during the videos, you can play those back as needed, but you do need to complete these 3 sets of questions. Now, you may not get them all done today, so we'll finish them on Wednesday. That'll be our conclusion, in addition to having a short discussion activity assigned as well on Wednesday, but it'll be related to these topic questions. Okay. All right, so what everybody should be doing right now is you're still in AP classroom and you're answering the assigned topic questions. Isadora, are you able to get into the AP classroom? Yes. William, yes. The question was asked, do you do the biogeography quiz? Yes, you do. What won't it let me? Yes. Yes, please do the progress checks, folks. Okay, so Wednesday, we're not going to introduce anything new, but make sure you go back and look at um, your ecosystem services, know what HIPCO is, and look at the unit for today. So 2 and 3, 2.2 and 3, make sure you know those. What do we mean by biogeography, fragmentation? So there'll be a short quiz on those topics. So if you haven't read over the Canvas pages, make sure you read over those Canvas pages. Okay, so 2.2 and 3. All right, and again, make sure that you've completed the AP Classroom activity as well. All right, if you've done all of that, see you tomorrow.